At 6:30 a.m. on November 8, 1942, the sea off the coast of North Africa was unnaturally calm. The moon was fading, the horizon barely visible, and hundreds of American soldiers stood packed inside landing craft, weapons loaded, radios crackling, waiting for orders that many believed would never come. They had crossed the Atlantic for weeks under strict radio silence, part of the largest amphibious operation the United States had ever attempted up to that point. Operation Torch was finally underway. The assumption guiding this entire plan was deceptively simple. The French forces stationed in North Africa were not German, they were not Italian, they were French. More specifically, they were forces loyal to the Vichy government, a regime born after France's defeat in 1940. In Washington and London, intelligence estimates suggested that most of these troops would either stand down or offer only symbolic resistance. American planners believed that shared history, shared language of the Allies, and quiet diplomatic backchannels would prevent bloodshed. That belief shaped everything. The landings were scheduled before dawn. U.S. troops were instructed to minimize fire unless absolutely necessary. In some sectors, soldiers were explicitly told not to fire first under any circumstances. The goal was not conquest, but transition. North Africa was supposed to be the soft opening move that would bring the United States fully into the European war without immediately igniting a political disaster. By 7:04 a.m., that assumption collapsed. Near Casablanca, American landing craft were still approaching the beaches when flashes erupted from the shoreline. French coastal batteries opened fire. Within minutes, artillery shells began splashing into the water around U.S. transports. On board the USS Augusta and USS Brooklyn, naval officers initially hesitated, unsure if the firing was accidental, miscommunication, or deliberate resistance. That hesitation lasted less than 2 minutes. French shells began striking close enough to shake decks and tear through rigging. This was not symbolic resistance. At Oran, further east, the situation deteriorated even faster. 2 British ships carrying American Rangers attempted a daring direct assault into the harbor, hoping speed and surprise would prevent bloodshed. Instead, French shore batteries and naval guns immediately engaged them. The HMS Walney and HMS Heartland were torn apart at close range. Of the approximately 400 men aboard, more than half were killed or wounded within minutes. Survivors later described seeing French gunners calmly reloading and firing again, methodically, without hesitation. By mid-morning, it was clear that the United States was not being waved ashore. It was being fought. This was a shock not just to the soldiers under fire, but to the entire American command structure. Operation Torch involved over 107,000 Allied troops, including over 73,000 Americans, spread across 3 main landing zones: Casablanca in Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and Algiers further east. The plan relied on speed and political collapse, not prolonged combat. Instead, American units found themselves exchanging fire with forces they had been briefing as potentially cooperative only days earlier. At Algiers, the picture was slightly different, but no less tense. There, elements of the French resistance attempted to seize key installations in the city during the night, temporarily neutralizing parts of the Vichy command. But even here, confusion reigned. French units received conflicting orders. Some commanders hesitated. Others followed standing directives: defend French sovereignty against any foreign landing, regardless of nationality. For the American soldiers on the beaches, none of that nuance mattered. They only knew that the guns firing at them were French, accurate, and deadly. Within the first 24 hours, American forces suffered over 1,500 casualties, many of them inflicted by French artillery and naval fire. Several U.S. ships were damaged, landing schedules unraveled, radio traffic exploded, as field commanders demanded clarification that simply did not exist. Were they at war with France? Were they supposed to return fire? Who was in charge? General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Operation Torch from Gibraltar, faced a nightmare scenario. Militarily, the landings were still succeeding. Politically, the situation was on the verge of catastrophe. The United States had entered the war less than a year earlier. Now headlines could easily read that American troops were killing French soldiers on African beaches. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations began almost immediately. American diplomats and intelligence officers scrambled to reach French commanders to find someone, anyone, willing to order a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. In Casablanca, French naval forces attempted to sortie from the harbor, engaging American warships in one of the most unexpected naval clashes of the war. Several French destroyers were sunk. The incomplete battleship Jean Bart, still unfinished in port, fired its massive guns until American dive bombers finally silenced it. By the end of the first day, one thing was undeniable. The assumption that shared history would prevent violence had proven dangerously naive. The United States had entered North Africa expecting hesitation, delay, and negotiation. Instead, it had met disciplined resistance, professional gunnery, and commanders who followed orders, even when those orders led directly into conflict with a nation they once considered an ally. And as the fighting dragged into its second day, American officers began to realize something even more unsettling. This was not chaos. This was not confusion. This was an organized defense, executed by men who believed they were defending France itself. The realization would force the United States to make a decision that would reshape the campaign, redefine alliances, and expose how fragile assumptions become once the first shot is fired. And that decision would come far sooner than anyone in Washington had expected. By the morning of November 9, 1942, the situation facing American commanders in North Africa had evolved from confusion into something far more dangerous: escalation without clarity. The landings were no longer tentative, they were contested, and every additional hour of fighting increased the risk that Operation Torch would collapse under its own political contradictions. The core problem was brutally simple. The United States was fighting an army it was not officially at war with. Vichy France was a neutral power, recognized diplomatically by Washington only weeks earlier. There was no formal declaration, no public enemy designation. And yet American naval guns were now firing full broadsides at French warships, while French artillery continued pounding American beachheads. At Casablanca, the naval engagement intensified. French Amiral Michelier ordered his remaining vessels to engage the American fleet, despite overwhelming odds. The French forces were outmatched, but not passive. Coastal batteries ranging from 138mm to 194mm calibers continued firing, forcing American ships to maneuver aggressively close to shore. The incomplete battleship Jean Bart, armed with a single operational 380mm turret, scored near misses that forced U.S. commanders to treat it as a serious threat. To neutralize it, the U.S. Navy committed carrier aircraft from the USS Ranger. Dive bombers attacked repeatedly until the massive guns fell silent. It took more than 1,000-pound bombs to do the job. By the end of the engagement, the French Navy at Casablanca had been effectively destroyed. Several destroyers were sunk, others were crippled. Hundreds of French sailors were dead. This was not symbolic resistance. This was a real naval battle between two nations that technically were not enemies. On land, American forces faced a different kind of challenge. French units were well-trained, well-equipped, and deeply familiar with the terrain. Many had fought Germans just 2 years earlier and retained a professional military ethos. Their officers were not improvising. They were executing established defensive plans designed long before Operation Torch existed. At Oran, French batteries held American forces offshore far longer than planned. The delay had cascading effects. Fuel consumption rose, timetables collapsed, units landed without full coordination. In some sectors, American infantry advanced without armor support. In others, tanks arrived before infantry, exposed and vulnerable. Casualties mounted not because of poor American tactics, but because the plan itself had been built on a political assumption that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Eisenhower faced pressure from every direction. British commanders, veterans of years of war, urged decisive action.
Suppress French resistance by force, secure ports quickly, and move inland before Axis reinforcements could arrive from Tunisia. American political leadership, however, feared the optics. A prolonged fight against French troops risked alienating public opinion and undermining claims that the United States was liberating, not conquering. Time was the enemy. German intelligence was already reacting. Luftwaffe units began redeploying aircraft into Tunisia within 48 hours. Axis convoys started moving east. Every day of delay strengthened the enemy the Allies actually wanted to fight. The irony was impossible to ignore. While Americans hesitated to fire on French positions out of political caution, German forces were exploiting the delay without hesitation. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations intensified. U.S. diplomats reached out to senior French officials, searching for a figure with enough authority to halt resistance.
The name that emerged was Admiral François Darlan. A controversial figure, Darlan was a senior Vichy official who happened to be in Algiers visiting his ill son when the landings began. By November 9, American intelligence officers realized that Darlan's presence represented both an opportunity and a risk. If convinced to cooperate, he could order a ceasefire across North Africa almost instantly. If mishandled, he could become a symbol of collaboration that would poison Allied credibility for years. The moral compromise was obvious. Darlan had actively served the Vichy regime. He had enforced German demands. He was no resistance hero. Yet pragmatism demanded results. Eisenhower authorized negotiations anyway. While talks dragged on, the fighting continued. At Algiers, sporadic clashes erupted as French units received conflicting orders. Some commanders stood down, others fought on. The battlefield became fragmented, unpredictable. American patrols reported entire French units surrendering peacefully in one town, only to encounter machine gun fire from French positions a few kilometers away. The lack of a clear enemy designation made rules of engagement dangerously vague. American soldiers hesitated at roadblocks, unsure whether the men facing them were hostile or merely confused. In at least 2 recorded incidents, ceasefires were agreed locally, only to break down hours later when higher French command reversed decisions. By the evening of November 9, Eisenhower had reached an unavoidable conclusion. Political delicacy could no longer dictate military reality. The longer French resistance continued, the more lives would be lost and the greater the strategic damage. That night, the decision was made. If Admiral Darlan would order a ceasefire and bring French forces over to the Allied side, the United States would recognize him as the legitimate authority in North Africa, temporarily, regardless of his past. It was a bargain born not of idealism, but of urgency. Within hours, the consequences of that decision would ripple across every front of the campaign. French guns would fall silent, American troops would move inland, and the Axis would realize too late that while the opening had been chaotic, the door to North Africa was now firmly in Allied hands. But the price of that decision, moral and political, would haunt the United States long after the shooting stopped, and not everyone would accept it quietly. The ceasefire did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with disbelief. On November 10, 1942, shortly after midnight, Admiral François Darlan issued the order that American commanders had been waiting for. French forces across Algeria and Morocco were to stand down. Hostilities against Allied troops were to cease immediately. Coastal batteries were ordered to stop firing. Naval units were to return to port. Army formations were instructed to remain in place and await further orders. For American soldiers on the ground, the transition felt unreal. Less than 12 hours earlier, those same French positions had been actively trying to kill them. Now, white flags appeared over forts. Machine guns went silent. Roadblocks that had resisted violently the day before waved Allied vehicles through without inspection. But the battlefield did not reset cleanly. Some French units never received the order. Others refused to believe it was legitimate. Communication infrastructure was fragmented, and trust was non-existent. In multiple sectors, American patrols advanced cautiously into areas that were supposedly neutralized, only to encounter sporadic fire from isolated French holdouts who believed the ceasefire was a trick. In Iran, one French artillery battery continued firing into the harbor until mid-morning on November 10th, killing several American sailors even after the official ceasefire had been announced. The guns were silenced only when a French officer physically arrived with written orders signed by Darlan himself. Confusion cost lives even after the fighting was supposed to be over. Strategically, however, the effect was immediate. With French resistance collapsing, Allied forces surged inland. Within 48 hours, American and British units were moving east toward Tunisia, racing against German reinforcements already pouring into the region. And now a new realization set in. The French forces that had fought the Americans so effectively were not weak, they were not obsolete. They had simply been on the wrong side of a political fiction. French North African units numbered over 120,000 troops, supported by artillery, armor, and airfields that were now intact rather than destroyed. Ports like Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca fell into Allied hands largely undamaged, something no amphibious invasion in Europe would later achieve. This was the strategic payoff Eisenhower had gambled on. But the political cost detonated immediately. News of the Darlan Agreement reached London and Washington within hours. The reaction was explosive. British officials were furious. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, was outraged. To him, recognizing Darlan was not pragmatism, it was betrayal. Darlan had collaborated with Germany. He had enforced Vichy policies. Now the Americans were treating him as a legitimate authority. Newspapers in the United States struggled to explain the situation. Headlines spoke of cooperation, but the details told a different story. Editorials questioned why American troops had died fighting French forces only to make a deal with the very man who had ordered those forces to fire. The truth was simpler and harsher. Without the deal, Operation Torch risked stagnation. Without speed, Tunisia would become a fortress. Without Tunisia, the entire North African campaign could unravel. German commanders understood this immediately. By November 12, German troops had begun occupying key positions in Tunisia, unopposed by French forces that had once been responsible for defending them. Luftwaffe aircraft flew into Tunisian airfields almost daily. Axis troop strength in the region grew from a few thousand to over 30,000 men in less than 2 weeks. What had begun as a race now became a pursuit. American units, many of them inexperienced, now faced battle-hardened German formations equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by veteran officers who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. The irony was sharp. The French had resisted fiercely when Americans landed. The Germans encountered far less resistance moving into Tunisia. By late November, the strategic picture crystallized. Operation Torch had succeeded tactically, but created a new battlefield far more dangerous than anticipated. The United States had gained ports, airfields, and territory, but now faced direct confrontation with the Wehrmacht under conditions that favored the defender. For American commanders, North Africa transformed overnight from a political operation into a proving ground. This was no longer about landing troops. It was about whether an untested American army could fight a professional German force on equal terms. And the numbers were sobering. American divisions arriving in Tunisia often had less than 6 months of training. Many officers had never commanded troops under fire. Equipment shortages were common. Radios failed. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was inconsistent. German units, by contrast, were smaller but cohesive. They used terrain intelligently. They counterattacked aggressively. They exploited American inexperience without mercy. The first major clashes would reveal the consequences of everything that had happened in those chaotic opening days: political compromise, strategic haste, underestimation of the enemy. The ceasefire with the French had opened the door. What waited beyond it would test the United States Army in ways no planner had fully anticipated. And very soon, at places like Kasserine Pass, the cost of learning modern warfare would be measured in blood. The first true test came quietly. January 1943, central Tunisia. A series of dry riverbeds, rocky ridge lines, and narrow mountain passes that most American planners barely recognized on their maps weeks earlier. This terrain would erase every remaining illusion. The German command in North Africa had a clear objective: delay the Allies, bleed them, teach them what modern war actually looked like. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel now commanded a combined Axis force of approximately 140,000 German and Italian troops, supported by over 250 tanks, many of them veteran Panzer III and Panzer IV units upgraded after years of Eastern Front combat. Facing them were newly arrived American formations, units that, on paper, looked impressive. Entire divisions equipped with modern tanks, artillery, trucks, and aircraft. But paper strength concealed fragility. Many American units had never conducted live-fire maneuvers above battalion level. Tank crews were trained for gunnery, not coordination. Infantry officers had studied doctrine, not chaos. Radios were abundant, but procedures were immature. Commanders still believed discipline and equipment would compensate for inexperience. The Germans had learned otherwise. On February 14, 1943, Axis forces launched a coordinated attack through the Fade Pass and Sidi Bouzid sector. It was not a massive offensive. It was a controlled demonstration. German armor advanced in layered formations. Infantry screened the flanks. Artillery fired pre-registered barrages. Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers attacked command posts and supply columns with unnerving precision. American forward positions collapsed within hours. At Sidi Bouzid, 2 U.S. armored task forces were ordered to hold exposed high ground against German advice explicitly warning against it. The result was catastrophic.
Deutsche Einheiten umkreisten die Hügel, zerstörten amerikanische Tanks piecemeal und eliminierten in Teile Bataillone, die keinen effektiven Rückzugsplan hatten. In less than fast 48 Stunden verlor die US-Armee über 100 Tanks, most of them M3 Lees und Early M4 Shermans, nicht weil die inferioren Maschinen waren, sondern weil sie inkorrekt deployed waren. Radiotraffic rekordete Panik, Konfusion und Disbelief. Units reported German tanks appearing everywhere at once. In Realität konzentrierten German Commander Force, something American doctrine not yet internalized. By February 19th, die Situation deteriorated further. German forces pushed west toward Kasserine Pass, a narrow corridor through the Atlas Mountains. If they broke through, they could threaten Allied supply depots and potentially drive all the way to the Algerian coast. The Americans rushed reinforcements forward. Units arrived piecemeal. Command authority was fragmented, orders conflicted. Some units were ordered to hold ground at all costs. Others were told to withdraw without coordination. Kasserine became a textbook example of how not to fight a modern enemy. German artillery systematically dismantled American defensive positions. Tanks exploited gaps. Infantry infiltrated at night. Luftwaffe attacks disrupted movement by day. Within 3 days, American casualties exceeded 6,500 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. Equipment losses mounted. Entire artillery batteries were abandoned. Fuel dumps were overrun. German losses were significantly lighter. But the most devastating damage was psychological. American soldiers realized they were not fighting amateurs. They were fighting an enemy who understood tempo, terrain, and coordination at a level they had not yet reached. One American officer later summarized the moment bluntly. "We learned more about war in 3 days than we had learned in 3 years of training." At the highest levels, alarms were ringing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood what Kasserine meant. This was not a local setback. It was a warning that the U.S. Army, as currently organized,
would not survive a direct confrontation with Germany in Europe. Changes came fast, brutally fast. Commanders were relieved. Doctrine was rewritten under fire. Units were reorganized. Armor and infantry were forced to train together in combat conditions. Artillery coordination became centralized. Air-ground communication was overhauled. And a new commander arrived to impose order where confusion had reigned. Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Patton did not arrive quietly. He imposed discipline immediately. Helmets were worn at all times. Positions were fortified properly. Retreat without orders became unacceptable. Commanders were expected to lead from the front and make decisions without hesitation. Morale shifted. Within weeks, the same American units that had collapsed at Kasserine began fighting differently, more cautiously, more deliberately, more effectively. The Germans noticed. Interrogations of captured Axis officers later revealed surprise at how quickly American tactics evolved. What had been disorganized resistance in February became coordinated defense by March. The cost of that lesson had been high, but it had been paid early. And in war, learning early can mean surviving later. The irony lingered beneath it all. The French guns that had opened fire in November had delayed the Americans just long enough to force them into combat before they were fully ready. But that same delay, that same unexpected resistance, accelerated the transformation of the U.S. Army into a force capable of defeating Germany. What began as a fractured alliance had hardened into experience.
And North Africa, once dismissed as a secondary theater, became the forge where the American army learned how to fight and win a modern war. The consequences of that lesson would soon echo far beyond Tunisia.
The transformation did not stay theoretical. March 1943, Tunisia, same terrain, same enemy, different outcome. After Kasserine, American forces did not withdraw from North Africa. They adapted inside it. The U.S. Second Corps was restructured almost immediately. Command authority was centralized. Armor, infantry, artillery, and air support were forced into a single operational system rather than separate branches operating in parallel. The most critical change was tempo. Before Kasserine, American units reacted. After Kasserine, they began to anticipate. Patton's reforms were not cosmetic. He shortened command chains. Battalion commanders were given authority to act without waiting for divisional approval. Artillery fire missions that once took hours were reduced to minutes. By mid-March, American artillery units were firing over 20,000 rounds per day, coordinated through centralized fire direction centers.
German prisoners later remarked that American artillery density had become impossible to escape. Air-ground coordination also changed dramatically. The U.S. Army Air Forces began operating fighter bombers in direct support roles rather than independent missions. Forward air controllers embedded with ground units began calling strikes in near real time. At El Guitar, March 23, 1943, the Germans tested this new American army. The Axis launched a counterattack using elements of the 10th Panzer Division, supported by veteran infantry and self-propelled artillery. Their goal was simple: break through the American line, restore momentum, and remind the Allies who controlled North Africa. Instead, they ran into a wall. American infantry held prepared positions. Anti-tank guns were dug in properly, camouflaged, and overlapped. Minefields funneled German armor into kill zones. When German tanks advanced, they were met not by scattered resistance, but by synchronized fire. In a single day, American forces destroyed or disabled over 30 German tanks, including multiple Panzer IVs. Artillery blanketed approach routes. Fighter bombers attacked supply columns behind the front. German losses mounted quickly. For the first time in the campaign, German commanders ordered a withdrawal, not because of fuel shortages or strategic necessity, but because the cost was too high. The Americans had learned. Captured German officers later admitted surprise at how rapidly U.S. units corrected mistakes.
One panzer officer stated during interrogation, "In February, they fought like amateurs. In March, they fought like professionals." This shift mattered beyond the battlefield. By April 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia were collapsing under pressure from both east and west. American, British, and Commonwealth units advanced steadily, supported by an overwhelming logistical apparatus. The scale was staggering. By the final weeks of the campaign, Allied forces were landing over 20,000 tons of supplies per day in North Africa. Fuel consumption exceeded 1.2 million gallons daily. Artillery ammunition stockpiles reached levels German commanders could no longer match. German units began surrendering en masse. On May 13, 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were captured, more prisoners than at Stalingrad. Entire German and Italian divisions ceased to exist. Among the captured were officers who had once assumed the Americans would fold under pressure, who believed early victories at Kasserine proved Allied weakness. Their assessments had not survived contact with adaptation. For the Americans, Tunisia was no longer a humiliation. It became a proving ground. The U.S. Army that emerged from North Africa was not the same force that had landed months earlier. It was harder, more coordinated, more ruthless in execution. And most importantly, it had learned that modern war punished assumptions faster than bullets. The French guns that had fired in 1942 were now a distant memory, but their echo lingered. They had been the first signal that this war would not unfold according to expectations, alliances, or polite assumptions. The lesson was brutal, but clear. No front was safe. No ally was predictable. And no army could afford to learn slowly. The Americans would not make that mistake again. What followed in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy would prove that the cost paid in North Africa had purchased something invaluable: experience. And in modern war, experience compounds faster than firepower. Years later, veterans would struggle to explain what North Africa truly taught them. It was not just about tactics. It was not just about equipment. It was about assumptions dying violently. For American commanders, the shock of French guns firing in 1942 became something far larger than a diplomatic embarrassment. It became a warning written in artillery fire. By late 1943, internal U.S. Army training documents openly referenced North Africa as a failure that had to be institutionalized. Lessons were formalized, mistakes were cataloged, command doctrines were rewritten. One phrase appeared repeatedly in after-action reports and staff memoranda: never assume cooperation based on past alignment. That principle reshaped American operational thinking. In Italy, American units no longer treated neutral or semi-cooperative forces casually. Security protocols were tightened. Reconnaissance was expanded. Fire support was pre-planned even during supposedly friendly advances. In Normandy, this mindset hardened further. When U.S. forces landed in France in June 1944, no village was assumed safe. No road was trusted without verification. Liaison officers were embedded everywhere. Intelligence officers cross-checked information obsessively. The army that advanced across Europe moved with confidence, but not naivete. That transformation traced directly back to North Africa. The symbolic artifact of that lesson still exists. Outside the town of Oran, rusting artillery positions remain scattered across low ridgelines. French gun pits, hastily prepared in 1942, still point toward the beaches where American troops expected handshakes. Nearby, Allied cemeteries hold men who died before the real enemy ever appeared. They are reminders of a moment when expectation collided with reality. For the French officers involved, the episode faded into the margins of history. It was a brief alignment of politics, confusion, and orders issued under pressure. Not betrayal in their minds, but obligation. For the Americans, it was unforgettable. Because it happened before the war's true brutality began, before Omaha, before Hurtgen, before the Bulge. It happened when Americans still believed clarity existed in alliances. After North Africa, that belief vanished. What replaced it was something colder and far more effective. Planning based on worst-case assumptions, firepower prepared in advance, logistics designed to overwhelm uncertainty. By 1944, the U.S. Army no longer reacted to surprises, it smothered them. German commanders later remarked that American forces advanced with a peculiar confidence, not reckless, not arrogant, calculated. They moved as if expecting resistance everywhere. They were right. In post-war interviews, General George Patton summarized North Africa with brutal honesty. "We paid tuition early."
That tuition was paid in blood, confusion, and embarrassment, but it bought something priceless: an army that learned faster than its enemies. The French guns that opened fire in 1942 did not stop the American war effort. They hardened it. And when American forces returned to French soil 2 years later, they did not arrive expecting cooperation. They arrived prepared for resistance. That difference shaped the rest of the war. In modern warfare, victories are not decided by who fires first, but by who learns first. In North Africa, the United States learned a lesson it never forgot, and every battlefield after that bore the mark of it.